I just want to begin by thanking the wonderful people here in Acadia for the hospitality that's been extended to me. I've had a wonderful time, and even the snowstorm I hear is part of the hospitality, that it wouldn't be a true East Coast experience without this. So I feel like everyone brought it, and it has been a great experience for me in the last couple of days. I want to give you a few logistical things to guide our time together this evening, that if you want to ask some questions following the lecture that I'll give this evening, there's a couple ways of doing so. If you're on Facebook and following us live that way, on the right-hand side of the video, there should be a chat function that you can both dialogue with one another and raise some questions, and perhaps if there's some questions you want to ask me afterwards, you can post those there, and then we'll be happy to follow those after I share this evening. If you're following on Zoom, in the bottom left-hand screen or bottom screen, you'll see a chat function there as well. And likewise, you can insert some questions there that can entertain following this discussion tonight. So the last two nights, we've talked about those who say they have no religion in Canada. And then we looked at evangelism in Canada from the pulpit and the pew. Tonight, I want to conclude with a topic of flourishing congregations in Canada. There's much research out there that looks at religious decline, congregational decline, and so forth. But where are the signs of life and vitality? And what can we learn from such congregations in these contexts? And so this is the subject I want to give my attention to this evening. If you were with us last night, I talked a little bit about the Flourishing Congregations Institute, where I'm the director of the Institute with a research team from different disciplines and different backgrounds. And one of the things that we're trying to do as an institute is to better understand congregational life in Catholic, mainline, and conservative Protestant settings, to provide empirical data that would inform what we know about congregations, and then to use that in ways that would help local churches in practical ways with tools and resources that would be of value and benefit to them. And so we give our attention to these things. If you haven't checked out our website, some of the things I'm going to talk about tonight, you can see some follow-up resources that are freely available. So I would encourage you to check out flourishingcongregations.org, where you can access some of those resources. And you can follow us on Facebook, on Twitter, and you can also sign up for updates from our institute as we share some resources every couple of weeks that might be of value to you and your congregation. Now, if we were here live and in person as a group, I would open up the following question, and I would ask you, when you think of a flourishing congregation, what comes to mind? And as you hear that question, as you think about it, maybe you're gathered with others from your own church and your own setting, this might be a good question to talk about in some setting after our time together tonight, is to begin to brainstorm, what would you identify are the important traits of a flourishing congregation? Are there things that might be distinctive to your own church, to your own denominational heritage, perhaps the region that you find yourself in within the country, that would inform your response to that? Another couple of questions that I think are important to consider are, what are the strengths of your congregation? I said earlier this week that every congregation is flourishing in some way. There are some signs or areas or elements of strength within your congregation. I think it's a helpful activity for congregations to sit down and to write those things out. I think it's very easy and perhaps very natural for us to get locked in what's wrong with our church and where are the deficiencies and where do we need to fill the gaps. But sometimes we don't give enough attention to where are the strengths that both we can give thanks for, but also leverage as a point to move forward on. So a question for you to consider. And related to that then, what are the greatest opportunities for development in your congregation? I don't think we should disregard these questions. I think we should give attention to the full span of questions that emerge within our congregational setting. And so again, if we were here physically live and in person, we might have a bit of an engagement on this, but I want you to ponder these things and to perhaps take time to seriously contemplate these questions with others within your congregational setting. I want to turn this evening, though, to some of our research as a Flourishing Congregations Institute research team to hear from the voices and narratives of pastors and church leaders and denominational leaders across the country. a little over 2 years ago, we set out this call to church and denominational leaders, and we were looking for flourishing congregations. We did not define that term. We wanted groups to define it for themselves. And if they considered themselves to be a flourishing congregation, or if they knew of congregations within their denomination, within their networks and sphere of influence and so forth, we asked them to put us in touch with such individuals and such congregations, and use that as a base point to then probe from these leaders, okay, when you either recommended yourself or someone else thinking that you were a flourishing congregation, what did you mean by that? What comes to mind? There were three things that stood out to us when we spent time with leaders from Vancouver to Halifax and cities along the way. And what I'm about to share briefly on this slide, and I should note here, if you haven't seen it on your screens, there is a link there that you can click and you can download the PowerPoint slides and presentation that I'm going through, and you can follow along with those as I reference them, and we'll try to keep up with those behind me on the TV screen as well, so you can see which screen referring to. But in that presentation and on this image here, the three things I'm about to note are captured in an article that we have posted for free on our website. So if you want to read more about these things in greater detail, I'd encourage you to download that on our website and read in greater detail. But three things stood out from our conversations. The first was that there was a strong divide among leaders between some who said that a flourishing congregation means that it's growing numerically, and measure that in all kinds of ways. It might be church attendance, it might be tithing, it might be membership, baptisms, and so forth. And there were others who were very strongly opposed to that narrative, who believed that a flourishing congregation does not necessarily need to be growing numerically. In fact, it might be declining numerically and would still consider themselves a flourishing church. This is one of the reasons that I've entered this conversation this week, and I entered tonight's conversation with a hesitancy for us to infer or to associate flourishing automatically entailing a growing congregation. From what we hear on the ground, from the lived experiences of church leaders, there's very much a lively debate that is justified and rationalized on both ends of the continuum for theological reasons, for social and cultural reasons, for historical reasons. And so our position as an institute is that we haven't really landed, so to speak, to say it is or isn't numbers, but rather to perhaps present these different perspectives for you to consider and maybe locate yourselves within that discussion in how you think about flourishing and its relationship to numbers. What I will say, kind of parenthetically, is as we look at some of our survey data, some of which I presented last night, those who are part of congregations for whom they believe are growing numerically are more likely than those in declining congregations to believe that their congregation is flourishing. Those who are sitting in the pews do tend to associate numeric growth with flourishing. And yet what we also see within the survey data is about 1 in 5 within declining congregations also believe their congregations are flourishing. And so this is an interesting insight from a sociological perspective of how those, both in the pulpit and the pews, are thinking about perhaps this complicated relationship between flourishing and numbers. The second thing I would say that we talk about in this article is that depending on the Christian tradition in question, the theological heritage that one is associated with, we see that there are both overlapping as well as conflicting narratives and perceptions of what a flourishing church entails. I'm going to share those things tonight, and that will anchor our discussion. And as we go through, I think you'll find, even in your own experiences, your own tradition, that some of these things you might say, yes, check mark, check mark, check mark. This is really important in our context. And you might see and hear some of the other ideas for theological reasons or other reasons that say, I'm not sure I would agree that that's an important trait of a flourishing congregation. Part of what we're doing is trying to capture the depth and breadth of the different narratives that different congregational settings and theological settings bring to the table. The third and final thing I would say here is that some religious leaders draw on what we call a supernatural discourse, supernatural language for explaining flourishing in their setting. By this I mean, when you ask a congregation and its leaders that believes it's flourishing, why they think it's flourishing, what contributes to its flourishing, they in many respects point to supernatural explanations. We've grown, we've flourished, we've materialized, not because of what we've done, but because of the work of God, the work of the Holy Spirit, because we've prayed and God has answered those prayers. And our task as sociologists isn't to question those inferences or assumptions, but to simply note, and you'll see this in what I'll present moving forward here, that there there is a strong organizational human element to congregational life. Religious organizations are human organizations. And this isn't to dispel or to set aside the role of the supernatural in what happens in congregational life. But it is interesting to note sociologically the degree to which religious leaders attribute their own flourishing to things beyond their control, that some of the things that sociologists might bring to the table would suggest, well, there actually are some things in your control that help to set the context for how you might interpret the supernatural being at work and so forth. So these are three things that lay the foreground for how congregational leaders define a flourishing congregation. Again, you can check out our website and you can read more about these things in greater detail. But now I want to turn to what we've called the flourishing congregation's construct. What are the different variables that leaders identify and associate with a flourishing congregation? We went through thousands of pages of transcripts, and out of those, we reduced these to three overarching, what we call domains, and a series of dimensions that fall within those. And if you happen to have this image in front of you, either on the TV behind me, perhaps you've downloaded the presentation, or you can find this on our website too. You'll see on the top hand of this image, something that we call organizational ethos. And within organizations, there are distinctive things that help an organization to run and operate, and religious organizations similarly depend upon some types of organizational elements. So I'll talk about those in a moment. The second domain that you see in the bottom right-hand side is what we call the internal domain. There are different things happening as it relates to members within the congregation that congregations are giving their time and attention toward, that they believe contributes to and or is evidence of flourishing in their midst. And the third and final piece, and perhaps the things that were mentioned more often than not among those that we interviewed across the country and spent time in focus groups with, are these outward domains. Things whereby congregations are looking outside the walls of their church and trying to engage those outside of the boundaries of their congregation. So organizational ethos, internal domain, and outward domain are the three overarching categories that I'll drill into and spend more time in these areas. What I would say as I embark on these things is that many of these areas are interconnected. We shouldn't just think of each of these in their own right, that what happens in an organizational ethos realm has an impact on what happens in the internal domain and what happens in the outward domain as well. So do keep those things in mind. I would also say, and we're very careful, very particular as an institute to stress this, that we do not come to the table, and I don't come to you today with a silver bullet narrative. I'm not suggesting do these three things and your congregation will flourish. Congregations are different and have distinct social and historical contexts, that things operate and function differently in a variety of settings. There's really interesting research in sociology of religion. Some of this comes out with Steve McMullen here at Acadia as well. When you look at congregations, you look at their leaders and you look at their attenders and you ask them, you know, what contributes to either growth or decline in your congregational setting. The ways in which congregations often talk about these, in growing contexts, you'll find that churches tend to attribute their growth to the things that they control. And congregations that are declining, where you're seeing diminishing attendance and so forth, they tend to say, well, that's because of all kinds of things that are beyond our control. And what we would say in the sociology of religion is that congregational life is impacted by both internal and external variables. Yes, there are some things that you control that contribute both to your growth and or decline. And conversely, there are things out with your control that contribute to your growth and or decline. The things I will share tonight focus almost exclusively on the things that you control inside of your organization. Don't be confused with inferring that if you just do these things, your church will flourish. There are a series of other contextual variables, but I would say these are some of the necessary conditions that can help your congregation to flourish in a variety of ways based on what we've seen and heard from congregations across the country. So that sets the context for then unpacking some of the particular variables within this construct. So I want to begin with the organizational ethos. There are four dimensions within this overarching domain. The first is self-identity. What we've learned in speaking with congregational and denominational leaders is that those who say they're flourishing are very clear on who they are as a congregation. They're clear on where they have come from, their history. They're clear on where they are today, and they have a clear sense of where it is that they're going. They're clear on their mission, on their vision, and they're clear of what they are, and perhaps even more importantly, what they're not. There's a sense that they're not trying to be all things to all people. They know that these are the things that we are called to be and do for these people, for this time, and for this place. Some shared this story or narrative to us that their identity was clear when they could articulate it on the side of a bus, which meant that it was short, it was memorable, and it captured the essence of what their congregation existed to do. I'm not here to tell you what your congregation should or shouldn't do or what it should be in terms of its identity, but one of the takeaways for me and for others as we interact with congregations is, would you say that your congregation is clear on its identity? Are you clear on the things that you're called to be and to do, and the things that you're not necessarily called to be or do for this time and place, given your history and context and people and so forth? One simple barometer or measurement of how entrenched your identity is among the members within your congregation would be to ask those who are on your senior leadership team, both paid and voluntary, for example, about your vision or mission. If I came and lined up everyone in your leadership team and I asked you right now, what's the core essence for why your church exists? Could they answer that question? And I would suggest that if they couldn't answer that question with a relative degree of ease, then it would suggest to me that all kinds of things that are done in and through your congregation is not necessarily funneling towards the main reason for why you exist. It's important to know and understand what those reasons are, and then to filter and funnel all kinds of things that you do as a church that point you towards, here is the reason we exist, here are the things that we are trying to do. And I will do this through many of the points that I'll raise tonight. I want to raise a question for you to consider. Again, these are things that you might want to take back in your own congregational setting for some discussion following tonight that would help you to lean into these discussion points. What does your central mission say about your congregation, and how does it shape church discussions and decisions that happen in your setting? I would say that congregations that have a clear identity use that core vision with which to make the decisions on a whole range of things, from hiring personnel, from which programs to start and or maybe end. This is an important part of flourishing. One of the things we heard from leaders is that part of flourishing entails knowing when it means for some things to die, and to die well, in order for new life to be birthed and for those things to flourish. And I think one of the things that can help you as a congregation to discern that well is to know your identity as a congregation, and then use that as a filter with which to make those decisions. So self-identity is an important part of organizational life that we heard was really important. Second, leadership. We could talk for hours, and no doubt many of you who are watching this have read books, attended conferences on leadership. We heard lots of different things about leadership. I don't want to spend too much time here other than one particular area among others that we do address both in that article and some other aspects of our work. And I want to focus on the idea of keychain leadership, of equipping and empowering leaders from within your congregation. The concept of keychain leadership suggests that there are some people within your congregation who have the physical keys to the building and to different rooms within the building. And the individuals who have those keys represent power within the church. What does it mean to hand power and leadership over to others? What would it look like to physically hand those keys over and to give keys to others within your congregation to develop and equip and empower other leaders within your church? We've heard time and again of how this has been an important catalyst and sign of flourishing within churches, whereby you have many leaders across the congregation, whereby there's a shared approach to leadership. It's not just one leader and everyone is following them, where everything rises and falls on that single individual. There are many benefits, many things to be gained for congregational life when you're equipping and developing leaders. First, you're helping people to leverage their skills. I think biblically and theologically, this is so very important. When you think of the different parts of the body who are contributing, are we giving space for people to utilize their gifts and to steward those well, both as a response to God on a personal level, but as a gift to the community? In what ways are we actually stifling a person's spiritual growth and development by not handing over the keys and giving space for leadership development? I think it's important, if you're a leader in your church, that you ought to be developing leaders within your setting, and for those leaders to be developing other leaders. And if you're at the point, either yourself or other leaders who are within your church, who are holding on to the keys so tight that you are afraid to hand over the keys to others, this might be the first indicator that you might not be best suited for a position of leadership. If you have individuals who are unwilling to hand over the keys, this is a marker that perhaps someone is not best suited for leadership, because we are not equipping and empowering the collective body for utilizing and expressing their gifts. We also know sociologically then that when people are utilizing their gifts, they have a greater sense of ownership, a greater sense that I belong here and that my gifts are being valued here, and that I actually want to give more because I see that there's value for the things that I can bring to the table. I would say that good, wise, and effective leaders are attentive to these things and create a space and place for developing leaders that helps not just in the short term, but it helps in the long term for the sustainability, viability, and I would say long-term thriving and flourishing of a congregation. We hear, for example, of congregations for whom their leaders are developed from within their congregation, who talk about succession plans, for example, of a lead pastor or a senior pastor, where they've been training and developing and grooming leaders from within that begin to fill in significant leadership roles. There's a long-term vision that helps the organization on top of the short-term gains. So these are some things I would encourage you to consider when it comes to leadership, and would pose this question for you then in the context of leadership. How do you encourage and hold leaders accountable in this regard? Do you actually make that a measurement by which those who are in positions of leadership, of how well they are training and developing other leaders? And if they aren't doing these things, what kind of accountability measures are in place to help in this regard? All right, third, innovation. We heard numerous stories of entrepreneurial activities, initiatives, endeavors, dreams, and schemes for the future that were happening in local churches and congregational settings. I could give you all kinds of examples, but to me, the examples matter less here than the willingness to take risks or try new things. I could give you 10 examples right now of what different churches are doing. I think what's important is that these examples would look different in different church settings because of the local context that they're in. Many of the congregations that we spoke with, they talked about taking risks, trying new things, and being willing to fail, and not interpreting failure as failure, but interpreting failure as a seed of a new idea. How might this idea that may not have panned out as we hoped lay the tracks for a new idea? And I would say that many of the ideas and areas of momentum that helped congregations to move forward came out of, we're going to try something new. It might be an educated risk of, we think this might work for this reason, but we're not quite sure, but hey, we'll give it a try. And it may not work, but we learned something in that process that then contributed to this idea. My encouragement to you is to consider your own context and ask yourself, what are the risks that we might take? And the risks you might take might be different than the church down the road within your denomination or another denomination. That doesn't matter. The point is that you're willing to try something new, to take a risk, and to see how that might open up new opportunities and new experiences for those both within your congregation and those out with your congregation. Some questions, therefore, to consider. Where do you possibly have traction that you could try some new things? Where are those areas that you might consider some possibilities? What demographics are you positioned well to minister to? Who lives in your neighborhood? Who might you try to engage in some new and innovative ways? Where are there opportunities for your church to experiment relative to its core mission? That opening point about identity and having a clear self-identity, that should help to anchor how and in what ways you decide and determine that we're going to take some risks. How do these risks help you to accomplish those core things that you believe God is calling you to for this time and this place? Don't try new innovative things just for the sake of trying those things, but anchor them and focus them toward the things you believe you are called to do. And then importantly, how might your board or finance decisions intersect with the ways in which you equip and empower staff and lay leaders to try new things? It's one thing to say, let's try some new things, but not provide the resources, human or financial or otherwise, to actually set those things up for success. And I think sometimes congregations will have all kinds of ideas, but you're set up for failure from the outset because you haven't put your resources in a place that helps you to do those things. And yes, that might mean we don't send money in this direction so that we can fund this new initiative. It might mean that we redirect our paid personnel or our volunteer labor from these ministry areas to these areas as we try some new things. It may take courage, it may take a level of risk to make those steps, but I think it can be worth it if and as you consider your core mission aligning with some new possibilities and opportunities. So innovation and risk-taking is something that we heard from congregations across this country. And then fourth and finally, in terms of organizational ethos, things related to structure and process. I would say that many of the congregations that we spoke to spoke of clear, effective, and functional organizational structures and processes to aid the various priorities and initiatives in their organization. I can think of many congregations where this was in play. I think of one here in the Maritimes in Halifax of a congregation where you visit their church, and right on the walls of their church was their discipleship process, almost like a big flow chart that was right on the wall, and it was present in different areas of the congregation. But it clearly showed, and as we heard the different stories of how this played out, it showed that there was a process for the first time attender in this church where they might fit within this flow chart, to someone who's been around for a couple of years to 10 years on where they might be in the discipleship process. And I mean, we sometimes think of structure or process as a bad thing, as a stifling thing, as something that can limit congregational flourishing. And yet we found this, and congregations shared with us, of how invaluable clear structures and processes are to actually help people to get connected into a congregation. To keep people connected in a congregation long term, to articulate a way by which you think things are important in your church, to draw people into those things. We'll talk about discipleship in a moment, but if discipleship is important to you, how do you disciple people? What are the structures and processes that help you to effectively disciple people? If someone came to your church for the first time this weekend, how would you connect them and draw them into deeper fellowship and communion with your congregation? I think a lot of congregations kind of cross their fingers and hope that, well, it'll just happen, and hopefully they like us enough and they're gregarious and outgoing enough that they'll kind of work their way into the system. And for some that might be the case, but many times this isn't the case. What are the structures and processes that can help you in this regard? You might be sitting here as a lead pastor, a senior pastor, perhaps you're the only pastor within your congregation, and you might say, you know what, I'm really not administratively minded. I don't really think well about the structures and processes. I'm more of a visionary person, or I'm a great preacher or teacher or pastoral care, but thinking about the mechanisms and how these things work is not my strength, and that's fine. What I would say is that comes to leadership then is to surround yourselves with good people, to surround yourselves with people who complement the strengths that you have and who can fill some of the gaps where these aren't your strong suits. Do you have people in your leadership group who do think about systems and structures and processes that can help in your vision casting to articulate those things well and to help create a flow within this regard? And so I'd encourage you to consider surrounding yourselves with people who would press you into these opportunities for structure and process that would help you as a congregation. I would say this to conclude this discussion on organizational ethos. There are some who might push back on this discussion and say, these things sound too much like business language and business companies and organizations, and we're a church, we're religious organizations, we're a sacred entity, and we shouldn't be talking about these business principles or organizational principles. And what I would say sociologically, whether you like it or not, is that churches are organizations, and you have people, and you have personnel, and you have all kinds of things that contribute to your organization that require an infrastructure to help you to function in a healthy manner that can help you to not just survive, but to actually thrive in the short and long term. And so I would encourage you to give attention to these organizational elements, as we've heard from leaders across the country, that I think can be really life-giving, that help you to do the things well that you believe you are called to do. So this is organizational ethos. The second overarching domain connects to these internal dynamics, things that center around those within the church. And I want to begin here by speaking about discipleship. Discipleship was a word that explicitly came up from Catholics, mainline, and conservative Protestants as a fundamental aspect to a flourishing congregation. That a congregation cannot be flourishing, regardless of your size, regardless of whether you're growing or declining, if you don't have discipleship present. Now, I would say one of the greatest learnings for us as a research team is the angst with which congregational leaders talk about discipleship. A lot of leaders believe that discipleship is important. A lot of leaders are grappling with, we're not quite sure what discipleship means. How is it that we should measure it? And importantly, when it comes to structures and processes, how is it that we can create a discipleship culture? What does that look like in some very tangible and concrete terms? Here are some of the things that leaders shared with us. And I would say we're leaning into this more as a research team. This May, we are participating in a conference at Ambrose where we're going to talk about and unpack some of the data from our survey, our national survey on discipleship and how this is playing itself out on the ground. But here's some of the things that leaders have told us. Discipleship involves disciples who are making disciples. And this includes within the home and within congregational settings. Discipleship and disciples making disciples starts within the home with parents and children. We may not think of this as discipleship, but it's a real cornerstone piece, and I've shared some things over the last couple of days here on campus toward this end. But then within congregational life as well. What does it mean for a disciple to develop and disciple somebody else? Is this something that you think is important in your congregational setting, not just from a leader who's discipling a congregation or a subgroup of leaders within that church, but for everyone sitting in your pews? Would you say that it's important for those who are sitting in your pews to disciple others? And if so, what does that mean to you and in your theological tradition? In what ways do we equip those in our congregation to intentionally disciple others? There's many different meanings and variations. If you recall, those of you who were with us yesterday, we looked at some of the barriers for evangelism, and some spoke about, well, I have few non-believer friends. How does that narrative for, I think I was 1 in 3 within congregations who said that, how does that intersect with the concept of discipleship? Does discipleship include an evangelistic kind of component, among other things, of also discipling within the congregation, mentoring others, and so forth? An active and growing spiritual life. lots of church health measures and indicators and different tools that are used out there will look at these kinds of things of where are the spiritual activities present, spiritual formation, spiritual disciplines. And so here we hear all the kind of expected things of discipleship, of individuals who are praying, who are reading scripture, who are attending religious services, who are tithing, who participate actively in the Eucharist, who rely on the Holy Spirit, who are fasting, other spiritual disciplines that come to the fore. That these areas of spiritual life and vitality are clear signs of flourishing within a congregation's life. And that the congregation provides a venue and avenue for these things to happen. And that you also see the evidence of that in the lives of those within one's congregation. I would say, as a side point out of our national congregational survey, when you ask individuals the top 3 areas that they say impact their spiritual life and spiritual activity, and these things are not particularly surprising, but they point to preaching, music, and volunteering as the 3 main areas that they say contribute to their spiritual life and activity, and if we might think broadly of the discipleship that is happening with and for the individuals within congregations. Preaching, music, and volunteering. Volunteering is interesting if you go back to that key chain leadership idea, that people's active involvement of utilizing their gifts is also part of the discipleship process. It contributes to their spiritual formation. By not creating the space for people, are we actually standing in the way of some of the discipleship process that can take place within congregational life? And then discipleship evidenced in the transformed life. How do you know if someone is being discipled well? What is the signs of discipleship? We would see a transformed life. And so one individual shared with us in part of our conversations, they said, quote, "Lives changed lives for me. It's not about being friendly. I can go to the Rotary Club and find friendly people. I need to see the litmus test for me. Is your life changed? Is it growing? Are you grounded? Is there maturity? Is there sanctification?" End quote. These are the kinds of things that give a testament to discipleship within a congregation's life. And so in your own church, 2 questions to consider. How do you know if discipleship is happening among those in your church? Could you articulate those things and write those things down? Would others within your leadership group, for example, be able to articulate those? And if you were to extend that to the congregation as a whole, could you identify if and where discipleship is happening? If you can't articulate those, this might serve as an opportunity to both do so, but also alert you to those structures and processes of how might we take some steps towards making these things more explicit in our church's activities. And then how do you monitor progress in this dimension of ministry? How would you know if today, February 13th, 2019, if 1 year from today, you have grown in your capacity as a discipling community? What are the markers that you would pay attention to? Our congregation survey is intended to be one of those kind of benchmarks that can help you in answering those questions in a reflective way that would help your congregation to assess and identify a variety of areas of discipleship. And with the free report that we provide after a congregation's involvement can actually help you to look in the mirror and help you in answering some of those questions that hopefully would generate some good conversation and action toward this end. So discipleship is an important marker of the internal dimension. Engaged laity. How do you know if your congregation is flourishing? You have laity, you have members who are actively engaged and involved. They're attending regularly. Regularly, I know, is a controversial term. 1 generation ago, 2 generations ago, it meant you were attending weekly, perhaps a couple of times on a Sunday, perhaps multiple times in the week. I know many of you are probably thinking right now, well, my regular attender comes once a month or maybe twice a month. And this has shifted over time, and there are many cultural reasons that have contributed to that. But there is a sense that our congregation is flourishing when we see our members who are actively involved, who are attending regularly, who are tithing, who are participating in activities around the congregation. They're not necessarily limited to only Sunday gatherings or whenever your community gathering takes place, but they're taking part in other activities within community life. They're volunteering as a sign and expression of their buy-in to the congregational activities. Those that we interviewed indicated that an engaged laity is also part of the discipleship process too, right? We talk about these things being interrelated. It's not one or the other. Many of these pieces overlap with one another. So being actively involved, actively engaged is a part of the discipleship process. It's also part of a hospitable community that we'll talk about in a moment here. It also entails helping members to identify their strengths so that they can be using those strengths in the context of your church. And there's many tools and resources out there, things like Strengths Finder, where you can help your congregation and its members to identify their strengths so that they can be actively involved in your congregation in the ways that they are gifted and oriented towards. What is problematic for a congregation and might actually stand in the way of potential flourishing is when you just take any able, willing body and slot them into a position because there's a need. You might have the wrong person doing the wrong things, even though they're well-intentioned. Aligning those strengths in areas that are best suited for them can serve as the ground with which your congregation can flourish. And no doubt there will be strengths among your members that you can leverage in these ways. Those who are actively engaged in your congregation will be proud of your congregation. They'll be proud to tell others about their church. One of the questions yesterday was, do we see a relationship between those who are proud of their congregation who might be more likely to evangelize? And while I'm not sure there's necessarily empirical data to make that strong link, no doubt, if you're actively engaged in your congregation and you're proud to be there, you're going to be more likely to at least tell others about that congregation versus those who are not particularly proud to be there. And so some questions for you to consider in your own setting. How engaged are people in your congregation? And how would you know how engaged they are? Do you pay attention or track these things? How might you possibly increase these things? How would you draw people into greater levels of commitment and involvement? Do you provide meaningful experiences for them? Do you take an inventory of sorts of your congregation to know what are the things that would engage them most and seek to engage them in those ways? Would you say that people are proud of your congregation? These are some honest and candid, but I think important questions to ask that help us to look in the mirror to evaluate and assess the degree to which those who are part of our congregation are both engaged and their degree of pride that they have within our church. Third, hospitable community. Sociologically, I've referenced this week a couple of times. We know that social ties are essential for a person to both join a religious community and to remain part of that community. And we heard time and again from those who we interviewed that they would say one of the aspects of their congregation that's flourishing, they would say, is because their congregation is a hospitable one. I've spoken about methodology a little bit this week, and it's important because here we're hearing from leaders saying that our congregation is hospitable, it is a warm community, etc. It's another thing to ask congregants themselves. And so this is one of the things we're paying attention to in our national survey to see what do those who are sitting in the pews actually say. A leader might say we're flourishing and we're flourishing because of these reasons. Do attenders actually say this is a hospitable community? Now we might infer, perhaps rightly so, that, well, if you're speaking to attenders in a congregation, they probably think this is a hospitable community, otherwise they wouldn't stick around that congregation. And there's an element of truth there. And yet we might be surprised that people attend for all kinds of reasons, and there might be some gaps or opportunities here. Linking back to structure and process, when it comes to hospitable community, there are opportunities to think carefully about, and we saw this, of groups who have a clear process to draw people into their congregation, to get involved, to remain involved, and to get to know other people. This might be through small group discussion settings. This might be through volunteer opportunities. It might be in sharing stories or testimonies, which actually provides a way for people to introduce themselves to others, whereby we're learning about other stories within our weekly liturgy. Creating explicit opportunities to get to know one another can help with this hospitality and hospitable community. Again, not unlike the previous observation, the evidence of connection within one's community, of how involved one is and volunteering within that congregation, is that one takes pride in that congregation. That you want to tell others about it, but not just that, you want to invite others into that community to be part of that faith community. From past research, we know that as people feel a stronger sense of connection to the congregation, they are more likely to reciprocate with greater levels of involvement moving forward, and they're more likely to reciprocate with greater levels of giving to their congregation financially. Now, I'm not suggesting that this is the reason why you should pursue hospitable community and ensuring that people are connected, but we do know that one of the ripple effects, one of the benefits organizationally, is that when people do feel connected, they tend to give more of themselves, of their time, of their resources, and of their money to organizational life. And we know at a purely organizational level that these things are invaluable, particularly for a volunteer organization such as a church, for it to thrive both in the short and long term. So a hospitable community can serve as one of those mechanisms, those vehicles for these things to play out in a local congregational setting. And the fourth and final element that we learned in our research pertained to diversity. And this was not something that we anticipated heading into this research, of diversity being an important marker of flourishing. And I would say, not only on this measure, but perhaps more so on this one and some of the other ones, that as congregations shared with us, you know, when you think of a flourishing congregation, what comes to mind, I think sometimes people are talking about their lived experiences. These are things we believe to be true and at work in our congregation. But I think some of the times, perhaps many of the times, leaders are also sharing aspirations with us. When we think of a flourishing congregation, these are the things that we aspire toward. And diversity is one of those things. And it was framed, interestingly, both in theological and in cultural language. There's a sense theologically that the gathering of believers together ought to reflect the diversity of the community, of the world that we live in. And by diversity, they mean different things. And here we see some denominational variations as well of how groups talk about and think about diversity. Most often, people talked about racial or ethnic diversity. A flourishing congregation is when you have members of different ethnic and racial communities who come together into the same congregation. Some spoke about gender diversity, particularly in leadership, that you have both males and females who are present in paid leadership and volunteer leadership and so forth. Some spoke about social class, that you have members across the social class spectrum who are sitting side by side. And when you have that, you find a congregation that is flourishing. Some spoke about sexual orientation, and to have a diverse, flourishing congregation, you have members of diverse sexual orientation, gender identity, and so forth, as being a symbol and representation of the diversity that we find in society around us. And then some spoke about diversity when it comes to age, that our congregation has a full spread of different age groups, that it's not primarily an aging congregation, but similarly, it's not primarily or only, say, a millennial congregation, but you bring the different age groups together as something that is good and healthy, and as some put as, quote unquote, right, theologically right for a congregation to be and to do. Sociologically, I would say, when you look at the research, that very few congregations are very diverse on many of these indicators. That congregations tend to be fairly homogeneous, tend to be more similar than dissimilar in terms of a variety of groups within, but there are some who are more effective in intentionally seeking after diversity than others. And one of the things that stands out in the leadership, it's not the, in the literature, and it's not the only thing, but it is the emphasis in leadership of placing diverse groups of people within your leadership. As you look at your paid and your voluntary leaders, do you see a representation of different groups among that group? Do you see representation on racial or ethnic composition, of gender, of age, sexual orientation, social class, depending on your theological perspective and how you engage these different forms of diversity that you believe to be important? This can be an important signal and cue to the congregation as a whole that can help to foster and contribute to diversity. Of course, there's many other things at work, depending whether you live in a rural or urban context, what are the demographics of the community that you find yourselves in. But for many we spoke to, diversity was important. And so some questions to entertain when it comes to these kinds of diversity. How diverse is your church, or does your church aspire to be? How might the desired diversity be reflected at all levels of your church leadership and beyond? If I were to push further into the question and conversation of diversity, we know that when you have diverse people, you have diverse perspectives. And so one aspect of diversity that was raised by congregational leaders was the idea that within their church, questioning and uncertainty was welcome. It didn't mean that churches avoided what they believed to be right and true answers to a range of topics as they looked to scripture and to other forms of knowledge and information for thinking about their faith. But they believed that congregations that flourish create a space and place for people to bring their questions and doubts and uncertainties. Last night, one of the questions to me was about thinking of congregations as learning communities. I would say some are looking for communities where they can discuss and dialogue about the questions that they have, that they can bring the diverse perspectives to the table, which, yes, necessitates that those who are leading congregations are aptly prepared and equipped to handle diverse perspectives and to foster in a spirit of generosity, discussion and dialogue among diverse perspectives and viewpoints. And so to this end, would you say in your own congregation that questions and uncertainty are embraced and fostered and seen as a social good for congregational life? These might be some great opportunities for engaging those within and out with your congregation. And perhaps the unwillingness to create a space and place could be a barrier toward flourishing, could actually limit your ability to engage, particularly young people today who want to have a two-way conversation and dialogue on a range of issues. The final thing I'll say about diversity pertains to conflict resolution skills. Again, we didn't anticipate this to come up within our interviews and focus groups, but when you have diversity, when you have questions and uncertainty that are present within a congregation, inevitably you will have conflict. People will think differently about all kinds of topics, and they will think differently about what should or shouldn't be done from a polity perspective, from a hiring perspective, from a programmatic perspective. And those that we interviewed shared that one of the marks of a flourishing congregation, and they shared of their own experiences, was that they had effective conflict resolution skills. Conflict is inevitable in organizations. Churches are not exempt from this. And thus the question is not how do we avoid or escape conflict, as nice as that would be, but how do we effectively navigate conflict that we confront within our congregations? This raises a series of questions for leaders then. Are you trained to handle conflict and to handle it well? Are we training pastors and church leaders on conflict resolution skills to understand what good, effective conflict actually looks like, both in a biblical standpoint and in a way that deals with people graciously, to honor the pain that is present, to honor people well, but to come through the other side to say that we are committed together as a community of faith and that we will ask difficult questions, we will confront difficult topics, and we will not operate out of a posture of fear, but to handle these with grace and love and mercy and to come out to the other end as a shared community. That these are part of the traits and elements of a diverse congregation who embraces and welcomes diversity, who confronts conflict in ways that are honoring to individuals who are part of that, and who can come out to the other end in a way that treats people well and can continue to move forward as a congregation. I'm sure we would all agree this is far easier said than done, but it seems to be one of those things that congregations who say they are flourishing say has been an important part of their aspect. And I think you might look in your own experiences and others when you think of congregations that are not flourishing, you might think of conflict that has been a central reality in such congregations, and the inability to approach and handle conflict as a barrier for potential flourishing within those settings. So this is the internal dimension that we have learned and heard about from leaders across the country. And then finally, I want to turn to these outward dimensions. These are the things that we're centered on most among those that we spent time on, that a congregation cannot flourish if it is not looking outward. And it will not gain momentum in the short or long term if it is not giving its attention toward these outward things. And so the thing that was mentioned more than anything else within this outward dimension was neighborhood involvement. To what extent is your congregation actively involved and engaged in the neighborhood beyond itself? To what extent do you participate in programs and endeavors and initiatives that look outside the walls of your congregation? We could think of, again, of all kinds of examples that congregations had shared with us toward this end of their, what they would talk to us as their incarnational presence in the community, of being the hands and feet of Jesus within the community around us. And they often framed this question for us to consider. They said, you know, would our neighborhood notice if we were no longer here as a church community? And many that we spoke to, for them, a marker of them as a flourishing congregation is they believe that those in their community would say that they would notice, they would miss our church if we were no longer here. Would the community around your church say the same thing? Now, as a sociologist, we always have to think carefully about what we hear from leaders, not because we want to discount or discredit what leaders say to us, but we know that there are many sides to the story and the narrative. And so it is one thing for leaders to say to us, yes, our neighborhood would notice if we were no longer here. It's another thing, as we're seeing in our national congregational survey right now, that those attenders within congregations for whom they are believed they are growing, for them to be far more common to say, our neighborhoods would notice if we were no longer here as a congregation. It is quite another if we were to actually go into your community and ask the question among those who are living in the community. And so this is something that our research team is aiming to do this fall. We plan to do some in-depth ethnographic case studies of select congregations. We want to go to some congregational neighborhoods and contexts from those who are telling us and showing us in the survey that their neighborhoods would notice, and we actually want to speak to those in their congregation. Go door to door, for example, and ask, would you notice if this church was no longer here? What would they say? How would they engage those things? And that will give us a more robust sense of what is or isn't taking place within those settings. Some ideas, some recommendations, if you want to engage this further in your own context, is to study your neighborhood. Where are the opportunities? What are the demographics? How might we engage them? Leadership needs to be really behind this. Your leaders need to model the narrative that being engaged in our neighborhood is an important facet and feature within our life of a congregation, and to embed that within the liturgy of your congregational setting. So neighborhood involvement, would your church notice? And if not, what does that say about flourishing within your own setting? The second dynamic and aspect of this outward focus is evangelism. I'm not going to talk about it here in depth. Everything I spoke of last night really digs deep into that outward focus. But this came up again across Catholic, mainline, conservative, Protestant settings as an important trait of flourishing within a flourishing congregation. And then the final thing, and this we certainly did not expect, but it came up in a number of different ways as an outward marker of flourishing sign within, within such congregations, was that their congregations partnered with others. If you think back to my opening remarks about congregations who have a clear self-identity, in these settings, they were clear on what they were and what they were not. And when you're clear on who you are, you become aware of the things that you cannot necessarily do because these aren't the strengths or you don't have the assets or resources to do, but others might have these things. And so we heard about different kinds and types of partnerships among those in our study. Some partnered with other congregations within their own denomination. Some partnered with other congregations in other denominations. Some partnered with other religious traditions altogether. and some partnered with other agencies outside of religious contexts and other secular organizations. What's interesting from our national survey data to date, we asked those who are sitting in the pews, how important is it that your congregation partners with members of these different groups? And what stood out there is that most are highly comfortable and believe it's important for congregations to partner with others within their own denomination. Let's partner with other churches within our own denomination. But they feel less comfortable the further out you move, less comfortable partnering with congregations from other denominations, even less comfortable partnering with members of other religious traditions, and even less comfortable, depending on the context, partnering with secular agencies or organizations. Now, there will be and there are variations based on theological tradition, but it is interesting and sociologically not surprising that our degree of comfort in partnerships tends to reside around those who are most like ourselves. And what we're hearing from congregations who say they're flourishing is that an important mark of flourishing is spreading the wings wide, flourishing with others and partnering with others who can help you to do the kinds of things that you believe you are called to do, and doing so with other groups whereby you find common interests, common strengths, and bringing those things together that help you to collectively flourish for the benefit of a congregation. And so you see, again, this construct, it brings the organizational, the internal, and the outward dynamics together. I'm not suggesting do these things and your congregation will flourish. It depends what you mean by flourishing. Do you think it's important to flourish numerically or not? And does the source of one's numeric growth perhaps matter? As we talked about, it relates to evangelism and so forth last night. This gives us a bit of an anchoring orientation for some possible conversation that we'll have in a couple of moments. What I'd like to do to conclude our time, in a moment I'm going to change our screen, but if you have your screen in front of you, what I'd like you to do is go online, and if you've been with us the last couple of nights, you've done this, you can do this right from where you are right now. Go online onto the website menti.com, MENTI.com. And when you get there, you will be instructed to input a short little code. That code is 577358. And I'll repeat that again, and we'll show it on the screen again. You may have it in front of you already, 577358. And when you enter that, you'll be given a question. And I've provided 8 of the 11 different variables, 8 because that's the most that this tool will allow me to use. And so I've picked 8 out of there. And I've indicated those as an area of flourishing. And what I want you to do is, in the context of your own church, I want you to answer honestly. There's no right or wrong answers. I want you to evaluate the degree to which you would say your congregation is flourishing in the 8 areas that you see present there. And you'll be given a scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And so we're going to turn the screen over in a moment here now, and we'll see some of the live responses. But I want you to go through those 8 that are there. This may take a couple minutes, and we'll give you some time to fill that out. And then we're going to look at, from those who are live streaming in right now, we'll see how you are engaging these topics. Do we see some higher signs of flourishing, if you will, in some areas over other within the context that you find yourselves in? And so in a moment, we'll see that, and we'll watch as these numbers change, and I'll speak to these as they are unfolding. Now, the numbers that you're seeing on the screen, I don't know how closely you can see the individual numbers, but the closer to the right they are, the higher the level of agreement people are giving. The closer to the left they are means the less level of agreement we see within congregational settings. And the numbers here represent the averages among those of you who are responding. So right now we have 41 individuals who have responded, and this number is going up as different people are engaging. And this is giving us the average scores of where we would see higher rates of flourishing based on your own admission. And I know these terms can mean a lot of different things in your own context. I don't want you to overthink these things per se, but they may give some interesting points of analysis within your own congregational setting. So we can see a few things are standing out. Engaged laity at 3.7, which is kind of just above neutral, approaching 4 as a kind of a point of agreement by way of an average here. We see some higher scores on neighborhood involvement and partnership, so some of those outward dimensions might be present more so than others. What's interesting is we see some things related to innovation and discipleship that seem to be a little bit lower. And again, these aren't things that are areas of critique, but they're things that might be worth paying attention to. If you find yourself scoring a little bit lower on innovation, to ask ourselves, why might that be? Is this because of leadership? Do we have leaders, perhaps it's yourself, perhaps it's others around you, who are less open to innovation within your context? Is it among some of the other leaders within your congregational setting? It might not be your paid leadership, but it might be others who are in volunteer leadership who you think are less open to the possibility of trying new things. Maybe it's those in your congregation. Maybe as a leader you want to try new things, but you feel like your congregation is reluctant to change. Some of the questions that we ask on our survey unearth some of these things to try to detect where is the uneasiness about these things. But I think it is important to have a degree of synergy across the congregation to try some new things and to try some things perhaps in a safe way. What is the low-hanging fruit that you might try that might be a safe opportunity within your congregational setting? Discipleship, again, there might be some fears or concerns or uncertainties. We don't know how to disciple well. We don't know what exactly that looks like. We don't have the structures and processes and mechanisms within our congregation to utilize an effective discipleship strategy. Here, there might be denominational resources within your own tribe. It might be through a theological school that you're connected to that can really help you in this regard. And so I just point these things as a possible starting point to reflect on and engage what this could look like within your own congregational setting. So we're going to move away from this screen. We'll go back to the main PowerPoint presentation. But again, I find this is a fun, innovative way, if you will, to give you a bit of a look in the mirror. As I noted yesterday, this tool, menti.com, comes from an organization, Mentimeter. I'd encourage you to check it out. It's a free tool and resource that you can use in your own congregational setting that could be an advantageous way to engage learners in different ways. The last thing I'll say, I've said at the outset, as a sociologist of religion, that I believe strongly in empirical data. And I think empirical data is a gift, really, for the church and for denominations. And the work that we're doing at the Institute really depends on good empirical data. And so I want to encourage you, I would implore you and your congregation to consider getting involved in our National Congregation Survey. To go to flourishingcongregations.org, there's a link for the national survey that tells you more about it, how to get involved, to include your congregation. And I think this is a benefit, yes, of course, to us as a research team and the kinds of things that we're bringing to conversations such as this, but really I think it's an opportunity for your congregation to learn about the different areas that we've talked about here, to receive a free report that might be of value to your own congregation as you move towards different areas of flourishing. Mindful that you are flourishing already in some ways, how to tap into those things, and yet how to give attention to other areas where you might flourish as well. By way of conclusion, I want to say just my heartfelt thanks to those of you who have joined us over the last few days. It's been a pure delight for me to both deliver these lectures, to engage in some rich and vibrant conversation with faculty, with alumni, with students at Acadia Divinity College, and those who have live streamed in, and for the warm hospitality that I've received here at the college. It's been a great experience for me. So our thanks for those of us who are here and sort of making this happen tonight, but my thanks to you for being involved, and I'm looking forward to the conversation that we'll have now from the questions that you've texted in, and we will transition to that. So my thanks, and I'm sure there's rounds of applause across the country. I can hear them from here, and so I will allow those to echo in my mind as we transition to a conversation here.